Offer up a brief land acknowledgement, acknowledging Hawaii, where I sit as an Indigenous space, whose original people, the Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, are continuing to nourish knowledge systems, understanding and wisdom in a sustainable way that allows us to enjoy the gifts of Ainan culture, for which we are grateful. The aina on which I sit specifically is located in the ahupa of Waikiki on the mokupuni of Oahu and the Pai'aina of Hawaii. I would like to welcome you to the Matsunaga Institute's Careers in Peacebuilding series. We are so delighted to have Fred Dust, CEO of Dust & Co. here to thoughtfully examine the joy of peace and conversation. I anticipate there will be a number of questions from the live audience, and we do have several questions that were submitted in advance. So I'm going to jump right in, Fred, with your bio. And then the first question. Fred, first, welcome. Mahalo for being here with us.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Maya.
Thank
you.
You.
All of us. We need peace builders more than ever, man.
Thank you. Okay, so Fred Dust is the founder of Making Conversation, LLC, and works at the intersection of business, society, creativity. As a designer, author, educator, consultant, trustee advisor to social and business leaders, he is an original thinker applying the craft and optimism of human-centered design to the challenges we face today. Using the methodology in his book, Making Conversation, he has been working as a senior dialogue designer with the Rockefeller Center to explore the future of pressing global needs, with the Einhorn Collaborative and other foundations, to host constructive dialogue with leaders, to rebuild human connection in a climate of widespread polarization, cynicism, and disruption. The rising influence of cities as drivers for change has been one of Fred's key interests in recent years. He's also proud to be faculty at the Esalen Institute. He is a former global managing partner at the well-known and acclaimed international design firm IDEO. Fred also works with leaders and change agents to unlock creative potential of business, government, education, and philanthropic organizations. He helps groups in media, finance, retail, and health to convene and align around driving change and various missions of social good. He's invested a lot of energy in the overlap between the nonprofit, governmental, private, and philanthropic sectors, and he has been an advisor to Influential Forum, as well as collaborator to leaders in groundbreaking organizations that mobilize grassroots communities and build movements. He's also taught at the California College of Arts, University of California, Berkeley School of Environmental Design, and Parsons New School. He's written for publications such as Fast Company, Metropolis, Rotman Magazine. His books include Extra Spatial, which discusses the design of spaces, Eyes Open, New York, and Eyes Open London, which are about looking at cities through new lens and perspective. He spent years helping to prototype and shape retail media and has worked in the art world with organizations like the San Francisco Museum of Art, Hotwire Productions, Museum of Modern Art, Galleria de la Raza. Okay, so there's more, but I think I should stop there. Fred, what an interesting, multifaceted bio and journey you've had. So rich and creative, so full of experiences from which we can all learn. So my first question, Fred, is where did this all begin for you, and what was the moment that made you decide this is the work that I want to do with my life, and what's the through line?
It's a great question. And I'm gonna hit maybe three moments that were kind of pretty critical for me, and I'll kind of I'll work backwards, because I think it's something that you sort of discover as you kind of write about this and think about it. But quite specifically, in 2017, the Las Vegas shootings happened. If you remember those, like they seem so far away at this point. But I remember like waking up that morning, kind of reading about it, going to work, and being like, just going about my day, not thinking about what had happened in Las Vegas, and then hearing that a colleague of mine had been killed in the shootings. And I think I recognized at that point that we had gotten so used and so accustomed to crisis, so like used to like being in the moment of kind of like these kind of critical, horrible moments, that we actually had stopped processing them altogether. That we actually had kind of like given that up as a practice to process. And I said to myself, there must be some way that we used to do that. And you realize that we had processes, rituals, traditions all through human history that have allowed us to deal with crisis. And yet now we've just kind of grown to kind of accept that crisis is going to happen as it comes. So that was the first moment, which is like, we need to build tools that actually allow us to do that. So that was kind of moment one. Moment two was waking up after the elections in 2016 and recognizing suddenly that like all of the work that I'd done, because I'd worked with Planned Parenthood, ARP, government, like I'd worked with Elizabeth Warren, CFPB, like a lot of work with the Obama administration. And in fact, my last big project was with the Surgeon General then, focusing on an epidemic of isolation and loneliness in America. And being like, they all went away. Because the moment that actually that kind of transition happened, everybody had to fight for fundamental human rights and things like that. So nobody was actually thinking about like, what's the bigger picture here? They were like, how do we protect ourselves? And that was a moment where I was like, what have I learned over the last kind of like decades? And I realized that one of the things I'd really worked on is how to kind of use creativity to host really hard conversations. And then can I give you one more kind of further back? My parents, for the most part, were mercifully out of the picture when I was a child. And so I was kind of like, I lived with my great grandmother for a while. My great grandmother was, just to give you a sense, was a pretty remarkable woman. She was a steel worker who had worked in the steel mills during the war and then decided she wanted to kind of keep cash and keep money and making money on her own. So she stayed in the steel mills. So she would work in the steel mills at night and then work on the farm during the day. And so I was basically raised by her for multiple years. And my great grandmother was the most phenomenal storyteller. I'll tell you a little bit about how to think about that in a little bit. But she could tell the most magical stories in 30 seconds that gave you so much insight into her, kept you on the edge of your seat. And what I realized is that in many ways, the practices that I built now in the last decade or so are still kind of based on things I'd learned in my childhood from the people who'd been around me, which I hope is true for so many of us, that we're actually looking back to others to pull into our future. So that's a little background on what brought me here, if that makes sense.
Beautiful. I like that it's an aggregate of push and pull, factors. That there are things that propelled you forward because of what was missing or what was lost, but also, you were inspired by your ancestors, your community. And I wonder, with your skill in the art of communication, if you have certain tips for us,
I do.
as we think about our own communities and the factors and situations that we are facing at this time. Sometimes this means we have to have hard conversations or confront our fears, but also, just I think the idea is, how do we feel resilient and connected and prepare ourselves for sustained dialogue and creative conversation as we're moving through this pandemic and the storms of this time into hopefully a more connected future.
Yes, I do. And I'm like, thank you for asking that question. And I'm going to start with something that feels really simple and then maybe kind of give you a couple other examples, if that's cool, Maya. But it's interesting. The very first time I lectured on the book, this was actually before the book had come out. I was like, it was like 6 chapters, and there were like 6 kind of, I call them creative palettes for conversation at that point. And I got through the end of the lecture, and somebody basically said, well, that's great that you have all these structures for how to have creative and fruitful conversations. But what happens if like someone's just like, yeah, no, I'm not going to even like, I don't like you. Like, I don't want to even be in the conversation. And one of the things that I kind of recognize right up front is that the very first thing we need to ask of the people who are in the conversations with us is, are you committed to the conversation? And actually, I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is not being really explicit up front, which is basically saying, are you today, are you tomorrow, are you committed to the conversation first, to the people in the conversation, and less committed or holding more lightly your beliefs or the notions of where the conversation needs to go or where are the outcomes. So one of the biggest kind of conflicts I see, and to give you a sense, I live in a fairly rural context when I don't live in New York, and it's a really interesting world where like nobody votes the same. Like it's not like that we have the same beliefs. And what I always believe is that you don't go into a conversation with the notion that I'm going to change your mind. When we do that, it immediately feels transactional. You basically go into the conversation saying, I'm here to be with you, to connect with you, to learn what you have to say, to have the conversation. And you see where you go. And so it's something that I really believe we don't do enough, that we actually are, we come into a conversation being like, we're gonna change the person we're talking to. And if we're not gonna do that, then we're not gonna go. And my feeling is like, if you can't commit to the longevity, the conversation, the work that peacemaking takes, the work that kind of like conflict kind of resolution takes, then don't come, frankly. It's like, and I hate to be kind of so, black or white there, but it's like, that's great. Go commit to another conversation, go do something else, and then we'll have the conversation we need to have. So that's the very simple thing. And it's very interesting. I will tell you, Maya, I had this with a big philanthropy I work with in Australia, where we start with a series of like, are you committed to this? Can you show up like this? Or can you be generous? Can you be whatever? And I've had recently like a big policy person in that meeting kind of get halfway through and then really not agree to the things that we'd all kind of come into. And suddenly she's like, I remember her being like, oh, I have to leave the conversation. And she did. And so I think by setting the precedent that actually, if you're going to be in this conversation, we're going to commit to that conversation, you start to let people kind of begin to self-actualize and say, wait, maybe I'm not here today. Maybe I should not be here. So that's one really simple one. But can I give you two other really interesting ones that I think, so actually, Maya, let me ask you a question, or anyone. I know that you have to, it's like, you might have to put in the chat, but if I say the word boardroom to you, or board meeting, what comes to mind for you?
I would say minutes,
Lisa.
Procedure, sort of structured, patterned, formal agenda.
Yep. Yeah, and we're seeing those in the chats as well. That's kind of exactly right. And so that's a really great example. And I'm going to throw out another one. And this is not meaning that anyone has been in there, but like if I say the word AA meeting, what comes to mind for you?
People standing up, telling their stories, confessing their shortcomings.
It's very different, but exactly what you're seeing in the chat is like a very different kind of, it's like it's almost the opposite. And what I want to kind of call out there is that one of the things that we have to recognize as we go into any context, whether it's a room, whether it's a kind of meeting or whatever, is that that there are implicit scripts that are established there, that there are ways that we expect those conversations to go. There are ways that we expect the conversations to be happening. And one of the things that we need to be aware of is like, when are we sitting there and abiding by a script, and whether that script is the right script for the conversation to have. And it's funny, I just came out of, I'm on the board of National Public Radio, and we were in our retreat. And this is exactly what we're talking about, which is like, what are the scripts we want that allow us to kind of be more productive, more engaged? And why do we live by one script, which is more like what you first described, the kind of formal, kind of like procedural, when actually the problems we're engaging with are real and now, and we need to maybe rethink the scripts. And so one of the things I want anyone who's practicing this to do is basically start to get really good, I call it script spotting, of spotting the places where scripts are already embedded. Sometimes that's a space, like if you walk into a formal conference room with a big mahogany table and big swivel chairs, you're sort of like, oh, okay, I'm supposed to act in this way. But sometimes that can be the rules that are established. Sometimes that can be kind of like the long-standing patterns. One of the things that's really interesting to me that came up in my research when I was writing the book, Maya, is that, and everyone here, when the word agenda, anyone want to guess where that came from? Anyone? Oh, so it's Latin. And actually an agenda used to be the kind of the structure of a mass. So basically people would use that was the term that was used to kind of put together a mass. And so if you think about a mass, like this was like a Catholic or a Christian mass, there's an agenda. It's like someone's going to say something inspiring. People are going to contemplate. There's going to be singing. People are going to turn to each other. So it's interesting how like we live by these structures that can be eons old, and we actually don't kind of like kick them and say, wait, how might we rethink this? I speak differently or more humbly with you all because you all do that. Like that's part of the work that you do, is kind of to kind of like spot the scripts and basically say what's going to work here.
Well,
so that's
we try, but I think that there is a lot of sort of unrecognized assumption and, you know, an implicit bias in the work that we do even. I mean, I think it is useful to reflect, you know, on whether we need to do things the way they've always been done. I think that's, you know, I call it washing of the eyes, right? So you're helping us to do that, because I think that sometimes university organizations and structures can be similarly patterned and we move along these well-worn grooves and don't often challenge ourselves, even though we're supposed to be places of fructifying, you know, learning and change, pressing against the norms and coloring outside the lines. Very often, I think spaces of formal learning can be fairly conservative in those ways. So thank you for
yeah, sorry, because that's like, I think we tend, like, the things that are funny about scripts is that they can feel quite safe, and so we might fall back into scripts sometimes, even if we don't necessarily want to. So I think that's it's an interesting point, and it's one that's well taken.
Yeah. So a related question is, I want us to think about our creative potential, which is something that you help unlock in folks and situations and organizations. And so as we seek to become agents of change, you know, activists and advocates in our communities, how do we get more creative and kind of unlock our creative superpowers?
I love that, Maya, and I have to say that it's like, what's interesting to me is that I'll step back, which is that in my mind, conversation, like really thoughtful thinking about dialogue and conversations, is kind of humanity's oldest tool, and it's the most non-lethal tool that we have. It's something that we should really be kind of leaning on as heavily as possible. Like it's mostly not deadly if you do it right. And so what I think is that it's like, but I think we tend to think that like a conversation or whatever should feel natural, or kind of just like kind of go in a natural format, and shouldn't be kind of played with in an interesting way. One of the things that I believe, and it's a point in our practice, is that my team, they're not facilitators. We don't facilitate conversation. We actually design the conversation. We think of it as something that we can actually get creative about. And that's really liberating, because when you're not a facilitator, when you're not responsible for saying, we're going to go right here, but rather saying, we're going to build a structure that allows the people to have a conversation, you have a lot more freedom in the ways that you can think about it. So one of you guys are going to think this is ridiculous maybe, but I keep, and a lot of my people do, a conversation notebook, which is just a kind of like, it's a 3-part thing that's basically like, whoa, this was amazing. I saw something really remarkable happen here. Wait a second, what do I think happened here? What was the reason? Can I start to kind of investigate that? And then how might I apply that to my own kind of work? And so the idea is that, like with most people, we're spot to start to look for things. We're looking for moments where like something really amazing in a conversation happened. And if you can kind of basically like take record of it, treat it like a creative journal, you can start to kind of affect it. I mean, I think this is, for you, I think that's a really interesting thing to do, which is basically like, let's notice when something really magical has happened in a conversation and start to unpack what happened. Maybe I can tell you one of my favorite stories. So one of my friends, Amelia Winger Bearskin, who's just this amazing, she's like, her mother was a storyteller for her tribe. She's like half, I think, of like the Bear tribe up here in upstate New York, and then half kind of not. I was in a meeting with her once in Dharamshala on the border of India, and the meeting was going wildly awry, like really bad. and it's like you could see it, like everything was basically turning towards like a meeting that had been like 3 days, 40 people flown from all over the world to have this conversation, was suddenly going to like pivot into this kind of dark space. And that, you know that day, Maya, where it's like it's all going to go down, and you're watching it and you're like, oh no. And Amelia, this is the most amazing example, I think, of a script flip and kind of spotting something remarkable and a kind of creative conversation. Raised her hand and she said, can I say something? And of course, everyone was like, yes, you of course, please say something. And Amelia stood up and she didn't say anything. She sang a lullaby. So she basically sang the lullaby that she'd written for her son to the entire room. And lullabies, by the way, are meditations on death and loss and the kind of faith that you can be reborn. That's actually like every night you're saying, go to sleep. Hopefully we'll be here tomorrow. And if we are, we'll be, but I'm always here for you. And so she sang that lullaby, and Maya, it changed the room. Like literally everyone stopped. I'm getting a little moved by it now, sorry. It's like everyone stopped. Everyone was like, wait a second, we can lose this moment. We can have nothing come out of these 3 days. And everyone just said, let's take a moment. Everybody kind of walked away for a bit and came back. And then there was this kind of reconnection to the idea that we had to kind of make the change that we done. And so I'm not saying you should all just stand up and sing in a meeting when things are going awry, except for maybe you should. I don't know.
Well, you wouldn't want to hear me sing. That would, I think, plummet people further into the depths of despair. But I do think that is a creative way to shift energy and to get people to be disarmed and to think about, look, we can change trajectories. There are no inevitables. We can reclaim, we can renew our sense of purpose and face forward.
Yeah. And
with spirit shining brightly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating about it is like, even in the research, like if you look at the neuroscience behind it, actually singing collectively. So it's actually one of the things that actually happens in kind of ritualized practices, that you sing collectively, you come together in a different way. And so so there's a lot of ways that you can begin to think about some of these things that can actually kind of like, oh, it kind of triggers like a little bit of kind of like, we're all in this together. Which actually then triggers oxytocin, which is kind of like what they often call like the love drug. So yeah, simple things.
Also, I think a lot these days about somatic solutions and that mind-body connection. And we've been hearing about embodied social justice, how we are collectively and individually a bit broken in body and form. And as we heal, we need to think about that. And as we think about, of course, the kind of peace of mind that is required for really fruitful conversation, there has to be a baseline, sort of anger management, equanimity. We need to be able to recapture our breath, to manage our fear, to manage our frustration. And these are bodily things that we try to govern with our minds. But when you sing, you're actually creating those reverberations, right? You're actually engaging in mindful practice with your bodies that is, I have to believe, very useful for preparation for that conversation.
I think that's like, yeah, I think that's, I think that's exactly right. And I think going back to this notion of like, we are our bodies do actually help us kind of move things forward. And there's research that shows that even like, if you kind of elevate yourself by 3 steps and have a conversation, the room feels elevated. Often it's one of the reasons why I think like the tension of sitting in a circle on the floor without anything in between kind of creates a different kind of dialogue. So I think that like we need to be using our bodies to kind of influence the ways we actually kind of affect our conversations.
Agreed. And really become more nuanced practitioners of sharing body language effectively, right? And you know, you're also bringing to mind, like I think about here in the Hawaii, the Kanaka community and other indigenous communities all over the world, why opening and closing protocols are so important, why oli, you know, chanting, or mele song, you know, why that collective expression is so important for grounding people, preparing them to be in the same space together productively.
You know, I think it's interesting, Maya, and it's like somebody was talking about your voice, but I think there's also there's a rhythmic quality too. Like once you start to kind of establish the rhythms of the way a conversation might play, or the kind of the tones, then you actually start to kind of manifest a kind of connectedness to kind of a oneness that actually allows you to kind of push things forward in a really interesting way. So, yeah, I mean, hey, use what we got.
Use what we got. Okay, Fred, so I'd like to ask you to please tell us about the most difficult, painful, the hardest conversation that you've ever had.
Ooh, okay. I'm gonna tell you two, if that's cool.
Yeah. And as
So
you're telling us, tell us, you know, like not just how it went, but why it was so hard and how you responded when it got hard. You've already told us one story of a difficult situation, but I'm not sure if it was the most difficult. And I'm thinking of like something that, you know, was something that you were kind of, you had invested a lot of energy into and what you learned from it. Yeah.
yeah, I'm gonna tell you one I'm gonna tell you they're both personal, but they're one's personal that's actually kind of more personal about me, and one's personal that's actually more about kind of like a professional context. So let me tell you the professional one first. So about 3 years ago, I was actually hired to be the CEO of an organization that focuses on dialogue, one that I was actually really excited to kind of run with. It had been kind of a weird interview process, only in the sense that it's like I really had only met like one or two of the board members and really had not kind of seen the kind of the breadth of the organization. Most of the work had been me external to it. And I was flown out to go meet with I was going to meet with the board and the organization like the day after. Like I was being flown out, going to be there for a weekend and go meet with the board and the organization after I'd taken the role. And as we kind of started getting into it, we started to see that there were some discrepancies in the way that the institution had been described or described itself and the way it actually was. There was a lot of stuff. And Maya, I will only say this, that the biggest clue that like a conversation is the wrong conversation or a hard conversation is when you feel it in your stomach. You know, those ones where you're just like, ugh, I don't want to go into this. Ugh, I feel like this is wrong. And so I had a call. This was on Sunday, the day before I was going to go into this conversation. And I called the chair of the board and I was like, this isn't working. Let's figure this out. Let's make a plan for the conversation we were going to have tomorrow. I want to make sure that like there's a plan in place, that we have a kind of like construct and a structure for the way the conversation is going to happen. And the board chair said to me, we don't need a plan. Just go in. You're super charming. Charm them. And I was like, yeah, that's not a plan and that's not safe. And I'm not going in. So I wrote a letter to the board saying, either we do this, whatever, or I will resign. And they were like, we're not going to do this. And I resigned. So I literally, before I went in, and so that's not a conversation. Well, it is a conversation, I guess, but it was basically sort of saying, this is an unsafe situation. They're basically saying, just go ahead and like be you and it's going to be okay. And I was like, that's not okay. Partially because Maya, you set that forward in one day, then it's the same thing the next day, and you're suddenly like leading it all by kind of just being like, it's the force of your charisma or whatever it is that drives you forward. So that was one. But probably the hardest, and I'll be kind of personal here, is coming out as a gay man. And it actually wasn't a conversation that I was having with the world. It was a conversation I had with myself. And so I had been gay since I was a kid. I like had been with men, had been whatever. It's like, but at the time I was actually with a woman. And I had this moment where I was like, I'm not sure this feels right. It feels like it's sort of the wrong thing. And so the conversation that I had with me was actually, I'm going to, for the next day, I was living in San Francisco at the time, just pretend that I'm an out gay man. And I'm going to go around and have conversations in the world as though I were an out gay man. And that's who I was. And so it wasn't anything, whatever, it's like go to a bookstore, go whatever. And the whole time I was just kind of embodying what that would feel like. And I got to the end of the day and I was like, that was the best day of my life. I felt more liberated and more kind of me. And that was what let me kind of go out and say, I'm gay. And it was a really hard series of conversations that happened afterwards. But that kind of moment of practicing, of basically saying, I'm going to put this on, see if this mask I'm wearing feels right. And it feels like it's more like me, that actually let me go forward. And it's something that I've used with friends. Like I have a friend who was a CEO and she felt like she was being bullied. And one of the things that I often do is just like, well, just practice for a day. Imagine you're not the CEO. Imagine you're like liberated in the world. How does that feel? And often that spend a day as can let you kind of feel like, oh yeah, this is me. This is the thing I need to be focusing on. Does that qualify?
Yes, 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 of course it qualifies. I mean, I think that, one of the things that you're sharing with us and teaching us is that sometimes it's taking those first steps internally, that it's not just, well, in the first example, it's about, you need to cast the net, you need to have, need to have that buy-in, and you need to have some, not simply single charismatic leader, right? It's not enough to have a proper conversation. In that sense, it's about sort of community building. The second example is I think that you need to ready the spirit and engage in that mindful reflective work, and that you need to remember that sometimes the most difficult conversations become easier once your spirit is settled and you've leaned into your discomfort and taken those first steps. So it's just a matter of moving forward and kind of owning the shape of things, the conclusions and the feelings that you have as you're preparing.
Maya, it's interesting as you were saying that, like you kind of unpacked something for me, which is that day in the second example was in essence it was a breath for my life. You were saying like, it's like you need to sometimes take a breath and kind of like live in it and kind of see. And that's what that 24-hour period was like, I just took a breath and got to live something. And that actually allowed me to kind of be like, I know the way forward here. And we all know the power of that breath.
Yeah. And one of the things that you're bringing to mind for me is that listening is such an important part of conversation, and listening to the self, listening to the truth behind and beneath words, that double listening, that deep and careful listening to the other, really being present, wholly, and creating enough space in the room and in any given amount of time that has been designated for the conversation, for listening, because we do so often think we're listening, but we're really just queuing things up to respond in ways that have been predetermined, and we're not actually paying attention to, well, how does my body feel in this situation? Where is my spirit lined up, and and what does the other person really need in this moment from me, and that sort of thing.
It's funny. So Yvonne just put something in the chat, which is listening without judgment. And it's like, can I just tell you a funny story about like the new work that we're doing? So it's like, we do our work, but it's like, now we're working on a new book, which is actually, it's about listening. It's actually, but I'm framing it a little bit as kind of like opening up. Like one of the things I think is fascinating is that we're in a funny moment where we are opening up the world. Like we may be coming out of some restrictions and things like that, but at the same time, we are closing down. We actually focus on our phones, and we focus on kind of going insular, diving into our screens. Sometimes we are focusing on just deep meditation and self-work, but not kind of always listening to the world around us. And so I started doing interviews this week, this is just one of my favorite moments. It's like, and I met an animal psychic, a woman in Germany who basically does animal psychic work. And so I did an interview with her this week because I basically wanted to kind of get a sense of kind of like how it is that she'd happened to animal psychic, being an animal psychic. And she told me a story. She said, I was like, so when did you first discover that you were an animal psychic? And she said, oh, when I was 30, I was going to hang out with a horse. And what was so interesting is that as I went to go spend time with the horse, I realized I could feel what that horse was thinking. I could actually kind of understand what it was. And so I was like, well, what was the reaction you had to that kind of first moment? And she was like, fear, utter fear. She was like, I was afraid I was schizophrenic. I was afraid society was going to judge me. I was like terrified. And so I shut it down. I tried to shut the door. And so now that was when she was 30. Now she's 54, and she's like, that's what she does for a living. She's a professional pet psychic. And so I said, well, you've made this journey in 25 years of being somebody who like being terrified that you didn't want to mention this or even think about it, to suddenly being an animal psychic, someone who's known for that. And I was like, what was the path to do that? And she was like, I had to listen to myself without judgment. And I had to do that for day in, day out, to basically say, you have to trust yourself. You have to trust yourself. And so what's fascinating about that story is that whether you believe in that or not, whether you believe she's communing with animals or whatever, the point is that her work was to actually begin to kind of say, I need to not judge like this feeling, and start to kind of begin to think about that as a practice. So it's something we're thinking about a lot right now. It's just kind of like, how do we open ourselves up? How do we let ourselves be receptors? Not necessarily that we all think we're animal psychics, but like how are we kind of opening our bodies and our lives to like what we're hearing around us and kind of understanding what that is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I have two more questions I want to ask you, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. So please, if you are wanting to ask Fred a question, put it in the Facebook Live chat, or you can, if you are here in this room, put it in the chat in this room. And we will get to as many as we can. But first, Fred, I want to ask you, I believe that there is a real price to pay for not having conversations. You know, it's the difference as we see it between negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace being the absence of acute conflict or violence, and positive peace being the presence of relationship, compassion, understanding, social justice, human rights, and so forth. So having conversations, tough ones, hard ones, you know, it's an example of positive peace. Sometimes it's much easier if you are in a conflict with a neighbor, a roommate, a community member, simply to turn and walk away. You live in your space, I'll live in mine. It's, you know, a Cold War. Let me, you know, and sometimes that's a necessary precursor to positive peace building, right? Insofar as you need to have things not be so inflamed, people need to have their tempers cooled, but it also, there is a loss. I want to ask you, what do you think is the price of not having hard conversations? Can you give an example of, you know, when people have really lost out by being afraid of engaging?
Yeah, and I think honestly, Maya, we're living in the last couple of years of a place where that's the case. That we actually not only are we losing ourselves, we are losing our family, we are losing our friends, we are losing our colleagues by not having the conversations that we need to have. So Maya, I couldn't agree with you more. Not only that, I sort of believe this is our job as humans, right? That we actually are. What else are we here for but to connect and kind of gather and engage with people in these deep ways? And so I think it's actually it's a vocation. We must do it. Hey Tony, what I think is, so I think there's a huge cost not to be paid there, but I think that one of the things we've sort of seen in the last kind of 2 years, and I was just kind of talking about this with somebody, where it's like we were talking about this notion of like, has the news destroyed your family? Like, and I think that it's a great example where it's like, if you can't have the conversation with people around you, you may just lose those people altogether. And I think that's been a really big thing. So one of the things that I wrote about a year and a half ago, like not this Thanksgiving, last Thanksgiving, was like the idea of considering having a silent Thanksgiving. The idea being that if you can't talk, sometimes making something together can actually kind of move something forward. So if you feel like you cannot have a conversation with somebody, cook a meal with them or learn from them, whatever. And that actually, believe it or not, you get the same bonds and connection that you do when you're actually if you're building something together, it's like having a conversation. It's just, there's no words involved. And so that's one thing that I would actually really recommend. And that was the idea, is like, okay, my family, one of my family members was deaf. And so I was used to having silent Thanksgiving where you'd actually kind of it would be wild and just lots of gestures, but no real words. And you still kind of get the sense of connection in that way. So I would really suggest that.
Well, I think what you're helping people to understand is that not all conversations take place with words, that you can, in doing things together, in mindfully holding space for one another, in being presence partners and holding hands through moments of fear or anguish, you are actually having a conversation. And sometimes if you are really present for that, and if you are really committed to that conversation, even if it's wordless, that it can be as useful. And it's different from the kind of absence of conversation where you are not present, where you are not committed to one another, where you are just fractured and ignoring one another.
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think it's like the notion that it's like when you're forging and building something real together, you are in fact forging and building something between the people you have, which I think, I mean, to one of Tony's questions in there, it's like, I think kind of getting to do something together is a great kind of intro to the notion that it's like, hey, being together silently, but kind of working together can feel like the beginnings of an introduction, Maya, to what I started with, which is like commitment. You're like, okay, well, I can handle that. Like, it's like, could I handle having a little bit more?
Well, so my final question to you before we go on to audience questions is, I'm very concerned about the fact that we live in different information bubbles, that we have these algorithms, whether on social media or news feed or whatever, that is creating a completely bifurcated understanding of the truth. We're on different train tracks going in separate directions in terms of our information acquisition. How do we deal with that? Like, how do we bridge that gap when those bubbles are so isolating, right? And how do we connect and address this problem of splintered information lines?
That's actually interesting, because I think that's a great example where I think that what I'm thinking about in terms of conversation is in fact the cure for that. So I think that one of the things that actually happens is that we kind of, and I think you're really right, Maya, one of the things that happens is we sort of fracture into these different kind of information structures, is that suddenly we're living in different worlds, right? So the world that like my neighbor is living in versus the world that I'm living in versus the town down the road, whatever, are different worlds. And so the only way to kind of begin to shake through those is actually to begin to kind of like really engage with those communities and have the conversation. So not to be a cop out there, but I think that's actually one of the things I really believe, is that it's by having conversations, even ones that feel strange or uncomfortable, and really like going back to that, learning conversations allow you to kind of begin to kind of get glimpses into that. And so I think the notion that like, we think of conversations, again, going back to the beginning, as learning, not actually convincing somebody that they're wrong, or convincing somebody, actually allows us to live in that conversation and then begin to blur that world. So I'll give you an example.
Of like practice, right? I mean, you were talking about that practice, whether the day of the conversation is the practice in that we need to really understand and listen and know one another, and to find ways to
Yeah, I mean, like I have a friend of mine, who actually focuses on whistleblowing in institutions, and what she's found in her research over the decades is that people who stand up, and it's not like always like standing up like shouting at power, but actually just basically like talk to somebody or kind of do something, often had a relative in their lives who helped them practice that when they were a child. So like they had a grandparent, they had somebody who would do that. So yeah.
Okay, well, I want to get to the audience questions, and there are a number here. So the first is, what insights have you gleaned about the importance of not just arts, but also space design? Because that's obviously someplace you've worked in for some time, to help facilitate connection that of the kind that we wish to create through meaningful conversation. Like, what does space have to do with it?
Space has everything to do with it. There's a whole chapter in the book that's basically like it's like the context actually is what establishes like so much of the conversations we have. I think there's like so many. I mean, one of the projects I did for the new school in here in New York was we were designing a kind of a giant atrium for their students. They were designing a giant building for them, and basically at some point I was like, what the school doesn't have that other schools have are stairs. I know that sounds weird, but it's like the notion that the staircase is a place where you can bump into somebody, you can stop and talk, you can kind of move to the side, kind of like sit in an elevated capacity. And so we actually designed the building entirely around staircases, even though it made it very kind of like inefficient. But it's the idea that it's like stairs are really kind of useful. I think there's a lot. Honestly, one of the most interesting learnings I had as I was like doing work for the book was basically that some of the most powerful conversations are not when you're facing somebody, but when you're sitting side by side. Like Planned Parenthood often talks about having conversations about sex with your kids while you're in a car, so you don't have to like look them in the eye. Or when I went on pilgrimage, which every society, every culture has a form of pilgrimage, the idea of kind of walking together in the same direction with people is really different than when you're actually kind of like coming face to face with somebody. So I think there's really interesting things like basic things like window seats where you can be sitting side by side and feel less intimidated by like kind of eyesight. So there's so much that can happen.
I have some of my best difficult conversations while walking with people, for sure. So that really resonates with me. Thank you. Okay, the next question is, where do you start when people are reticent about talking, but curious about dialogue? And how do you stop the dialogue from escalating to anger?
It's a great question, Tony. And I think what's interesting about that is that it's like, is one of the things that I would suggest is that in that kind of context, and it's something that I think about a lot it's like start in shorter bites. So rather than kind of saying, oh, this is an hour conversation about something, or this is going to be like whatever, like start to kind of like cut it back. So it's like, so I have somebody who I regularly have really hard conversations with, and we kind of have that. And it's like, at some point I was like, this is better if I break it down into like, let's have coffee for 15 minutes and then we'll have that coffee, again in a month or something like that. So one of the things I try to do is like, you don't have to live in like the opportunity for something to go wrong. You can actually kind of break it into smaller pieces and start to kind of like ease into the notion of a hard conversation. We often think about a hard conversation as something where you're like, I gotta sit. It's really funny, Maya, that you were talking about listening. All of the language that we use around listening is like, it's work language. It's like, I'm going to go give people a good listening to, or it's like, I'm going to do, it's this kind of arduous thing. So make it feel smaller, lighter, less kind of like it's you're committing the rest of your life rather than you're just committing the next 10 minutes.
Thank you. Advice for challenging conversations with those of different generations so that we can have intergenerational duet. So perhaps they're separated by many decades, i.e. middle age with teens or middle age with elderly. How do you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa. And it's actually interesting, like one of my clients it focuses specifically on advocacy for aging population. And it's a conversation that we're having with them. And this is a great example. And I'll tell you this kind of funny story. Like I was doing an interview for Fortune magazine, I think, and it was the Hong Kong bureau of Fortune magazine, and it's like and Hong Kong today is very different than Hong Kong was like 4 years ago. And this was actually about a year and a half ago. and they asked a sort of similar question. And I was like, one of the things I thought was really interesting is like, if you're young and you're having like troubles with your great grandmother because of that's actually the generational kind of barriers that are happening like in that space, go ask her to teach you how to make her favorite recipe. It's the same thing. It's like go do this. Or it's like if you're I talked about this before, it's like if you're can't have conversations with your stepfather, go ask him to teach you how to play golf or something like that. So it's like again, I think this notion of like start to kind of be, which is, it's a little bit about respect, but it also kind of is about kind of like allowing people to kind of build new kinds of bonds. So I think that's an interesting thing. Ask a 12-year-old what exactly is the metaverse? It's like, or show you, or teach me how to TikTok. It's like go there.
Well, you're pointing out that we do have things to teach one another, that there is value in those intergenerational duets. And I'm reminded of, I have a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old. The eldest is very loquacious and very expressive and communicative. The younger one less so. And so I asked her to teach me how to play her game because she's a gamer. And I was really dreadful at it, to be honest with you. I had my little avatar and it was like banging into the wall repeatedly and looking up at the ceiling somehow instead of forward. But it was a wonderful opportunity for connection. And I was thinking, as you were talking about those wordless conversations, the conversation was taking place. And what I was saying to her is, I may not have these skills or interests, but I'm interested in you. And I care about what it is that you care about. And you're really good at this and I admire you. And what she did was when I was losing terribly, she said, "It's okay, Mom, I got you." And she took over so that my avatar wouldn't be on the very bottom of the score panel. But, she was letting me know that she appreciated, I think, my efforts and that she wasn't going to let me be a loser because she loves me. And we didn't exchange any words, really.
I love that example. That's exactly it, Maya. And it's like, what a great conversation. It's like, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so Fred, there are a few comments here about how to get in touch with you. Thank you, Jose and Tony, for putting the name of the book in the chat, Making Conversations, as well as the link to get to know more about Fred and his work. And that's at www.dustand.co. Thank you. Okay, so we have here one final question. Fred, what are your thoughts on what we need to teach our kids, our keiki, in having creative conversations? And I do want to think about this because, we're handing the baton on. We're looking at that next generation. And we here at the Matsunaga Institute are an educational organization. And and this abuts the previous question nicely, I think, but there are generational differences. I may be feeling a little bit concerned, I guess, that because of the pandemic and the fact that we have been in front of screens and physically isolated from one another and not in community, that young people are not really able to converse with their friend groups, with their peers and with others as effectively. They haven't had enough practice. And it's not just the pandemic, it is, of course, the uses of technology and the various ways in which their daily lives have changed. And there isn't much opportunity for face-to-face conversation. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think are the ramifications there? And one, and then two, how do we bridge that gap and teach our young people how to have creative, brave conversations?
It's, it's so interesting, Maya. So I actually feel like this is coming to me a lot right now, and it's actually something that I feel like is so you can feel the urgency in the topic. And one of the things, I was just talking to somebody in Australia who was asking me the same thing about a school system there, And one of the things I think is interesting is like maybe not to get them into a place where they're having conversations that are hard conversations up front, but rather get them focused on conversations around things that they're interested in. So, it's like I write about a school in the book that basically everyone kind of uses Harry Potter as the metaphor, to kind of to have a conversation. And so there's like this way in that's different. So I would say that like anything, like often the best ways to kind of start a conversation is like, well, Maya, what are you and I both interested in? It happens to be that we're both interested in peace and all kinds of like big topics. But it's like, but by doing that, like you let them kind of go in small steps, as opposed to kind of getting in the safe way. And then Maya, I think it's the thing, and this is the role of grandparents, parents, which is like get them to practice, like ask them to tell you about like something like that's totally ridiculous, it's like, or tell, we did work years ago that was looking at how to get parents to read to kids, and we realized you don't have to read to kids, you can talk to them about your tattoos, you can do anything. Like it's like just make sure that you're practicing early. So I think it's a practice, and I think it's one that we have to kind of really just be really working on in any way possible.
Thank you so much. That makes a lot of
It's a big
sense.
question. I'm
So
like so
thank you. So that was the last question in chat. But before we go, there's one more question, and that's just looking to the future, because we want to have a futures perspective, right? And many of us are frustrated by public discourse right now. From your vantage point, where are we headed as a society, as a world, conversationally, with shrinking attention spans and, with information armor, how can we turn things around in our own lives and in society, and sort of unlock the potential of the future for unification? Where are we heading?
Well, I mean, let me talk first about where I think we should be heading. I believe, and I think actually the last 2 years is a great example, the last couple of years, is that we've spent years, decades even, living in dystopia. Kind of like if you think about like the fiction that we read, what young adult novels are, like they're often dystopian fiction. It's like the Hunger Games and all these kinds of things. And I think that when we train ourselves on dystopia, we have no choice but to make dystopia. It's what we know. And so I think one of the things we need to start to do is start to have conversations about utopia, about what is the positive future, because only by beginning to envision what that is together can we train ourselves on the future that we want to have. So that's, I think, a mistake we made, Maya, over the last kind of like 30 years, is we got too comfortable living in a dystopic future, and then that's what we kind of make out of it. So that leaves us in a very crucial moment, which is like, do we choose that dystopia, or do we choose as like a small group of fighters or whatever to kind of say, no, we want to kind of craft that utopic vision and kind of go there. So we are in a serious moment.
We talk a lot about backwards mapping and the need to envision first the harvest, or, when we are building beloved community, we have to first envision that community. And I think that makes a lot of sense. If we cannot see it, we don't believe it, and we cannot build it. So that makes a lot of sense. This has been so delightful. We have come to our the end of the hour, but I really appreciate the wisdom, the insight, and the fun that we've had in the last hour. And I hope that all of us who are listening here today can apply some of these concepts in our own lives and communities. I do urge you to share what you've learned. There will be a recording available for you to share, but also share at the dinner table, or in your own conversations, or watch it again on our YouTube page, and find places where you can begin to explore the designing of courageous conversations with young people in schools or out in the community, or indeed anywhere. But thank you so much, Fred. Thank you, not just to the Matsunaga Institute and Jose, but also to all of our myriad thought partners and those who are streaming on our Facebook Lives. But Jose, would you like to add anything before we close?
Just thanks to both of you. This is just really wonderful, such an enriching conversation. I, on the other spectrum, have youth at early ages, and so I'm getting tips right now on how best to connect as they're just learning about words. They definitely know about nonverbal communication. And it's amazing how they communicate. I think at like after like the first, second week of them being alive, I had to decipher like what they wanted, you know, nonverbally. And so I love the evolution of communication, how, you know, we can connect.
Yeah.
So many different
There
ways.
is a program called Roots of Empathy that I don't know if you folks have heard of, but they put babies on green blankets and they have elementary school kids trying to surmise. I mean, the baby's with the parent, right? It's not just a baby dropped off, but they have elementary school kids and cluster around trying to surmise, what does the baby need? You know, what is the baby feeling right now? And it's this Roots of Empathy is about precisely that, like learning about the nonverbal cues that are given so that we might be more nuanced readers of one another and listeners. So, you know, you're doing important work there, Jose. Well, thank you, all of you, for being part of our community. And it's lovely to see your faces here, and beautiful to know that you are out there doing good work in the world. And thank you, Fred, for being part of our Ohana as well. Aloha, everyone.